As I've listened to certain leftist figures on YouTube, like Ethan is Online or Destiny, I've noticed that they tend to not really engage with rightist ideas in any meaningful, rational way. Usually they focus on various kinds of fear mongering over rightist ideas and attitudes. And the punchline of this is always that the right is some kind of absolute evil that necessarily will lead to human suffering. All the while, they hold on to the moral prejudice that they are the good guys of history, while the right are the bad guys. As Ryan Falk has explained, the left has always had a kind of presumptuous self-definition. We're liberals, we're progressives, we're the side that helps people and cares about people and unites everyone under one banner. But if you look at the way these people have actually behaved throughout history, and what the consequence of their outlook on culture and society is, it becomes quite evident that their universal claim to be the good guys is tenuous. One example is the leftist dialectic on race and nationalism, which I talked a bit about in my Dialectics of Nationalism video. To reiterate, leftists argue that nationalism is hateful because it's based on division and otherization. This otherization must necessarily lead to genocide due to the antipathy that nationalist separation causes. Recognizing different races rather than one humanity must, they argue, result in races hating each other and being unable to live harmoniously together. Nationalism is therefore based chiefly on division and violence, but leftists do not examine what the actual consequences of universalism and international collectivism are when they're making the presumptuous claim that their globalism is somehow an ideology of world peace and unity in contradiction to nationalism. One historical example of this leftist humanitarian collectivism resulting in bloodshed is the cultural and ethnic genocide of Ukrainians during the Holodomor. Stalin was faced with the question of what to do about the integration of Ukraine into the Soviet Union, since it had a distinct culture vis-a-vis the Russians, as well as internal division between ethnic Russians living in Ukraine and the Ukrainian population itself. Initially, he pursued a policy called Ukrainianization, in which Ukraine is allowed to have and promote its own separate culture inside of its territory, but Stalin eventually abandoned this plan and began rooting out Ukrainian culture in favor of Russian culture. Ukrainian national heroes were replaced by Russian ones, schools were required to teach students in Russian, Ukrainian art and poetry was replaced by Russian art and poetry, and so on. This was a prelude to a deliberate mass starvation of Ukrainians by the Soviet state, where collectivization brigades came in and stole food from Ukrainian peasants in the name of the internationalist collectivization. While there was some debate about whether the Holodomor was ethnically motivated, about whether it's like a true genocide, but the context of the integration of Ukraine into the Soviet Union and the reversal of the policy of Ukrainianization made it almost certain that this was an attempt to eradicate the unique ethnic differences that Ukraine had from Russia, which were making collective integration problematic. If you think about the difference in exhortation between the nationalist and internationalist worldview, it becomes more clear that the leftist position of global integration is essentially a policy with a violent erasure of unique differences between peoples. Nationalists want to draw borders around cultures and races for the sake of the defense of these things existentially. However, for internationalists, the basic obstacle to the unification of humanity is differences in the way of life. For example, religions are mutually opposing and often imperializing. Muslims believe in the establishment of a global caliphate. Christians believe in converting the whole globe to Christianity. These two religions cannot live side by side together without one giving way to the other. To integrate Christians and Muslims into a single international order would require a cultural genocide, to put it bluntly, in which the culture of one or the other is redefined from the outside to ensure compatibility with the other group. In the worst case, it might mean the actual eradication of religion, as the communists argue should take place, which is also a form of cultural genocide. And in the case of cultures and races, the differences in behavior that cultural and racial differences cause are always a natural source of conflict and antipathy. To resolve this antipathy would require the minimization of differences between these groups, which involves the forced mixture or standardization of them. Ultimately, the onus is on leftists to prove that internationalism is somehow less violent or hateful than nationalism. To draw existential borders around your own group for mutual defense is somehow hateful, while the forceful eradication of races and cultures for the sake of integration is somehow peaceful. It may be true that leftists, if they were to carry out their internationalist project, might achieve unity, but at what cost? How much blood would have to be spilled so that people can be convinced to let go of their unique existences? Once you realize that genocide can be carried out by leftists without even having a race concept at all, the notion that the right can be uniquely evil and genocidal becomes almost laughable. And it might be laughable if the left themselves were not so potentially dangerous. Now, Ethan is online has been pretty vocal in his support for the fat positivity movement. He believes that ascribing any negative qualities whatsoever to obesity is a form of hate and discrimination, and that the path to equity is recognizing the validity of every person. If you disagree with Ethan on fat people, you must be a fascist. But we could actually argue in favor of treating obesity negatively in society from a leftist perspective. And to explain this, I have to establish a couple of things. First of all, obesity requires a large food surplus to exist, a surplus that does not exist in places like India or Africa, especially among the very poorest. And furthermore, what obesity actually entails is overconsumption and food hoarding. A fat person, regardless of his genetics, objectively eats more than he needs to sustain his body, which is why he becomes obese. He eats a calorie surplus. That's the only way, other than the side effects of certain medications or certain diseases like type 1 diabetes, that he can become obese. It's worth noting that the majority of obese people do not have those underlying preconditions that cause obesity. They just choose to overeat. I want to ask leftists and the fat positivity movement the following question. How do you feel about obese people in the United States consuming far more food than a single person needs to live when there are children starving in Africa? Africans need that food just as much as Americans do, and it would be most equitable if the excess calories normally consumed here were simply shipped to Africans so they could eat what they need to survive. The basic reality is that obesity is a privilege, and since it is a privilege, there's a reason to be opposed to obesity and to have a negative outlook on obese people. Their overconsumption of food is profoundly antisocial, especially when we expand the moral circle out to humanity as a whole, as leftists tend to do. If you look at the theory of Marxism and certain kinds of left anarchism, they always argue that people who hoard resources should have those resources confiscated by force. That is what would best guarantee the collective benefit. So why do we treat fat people with kid gloves? Why do we treat them as though they are not complicit in the very consumerism under capitalism that deprives the world of needed resources? All the while, by consuming more than they need, they reinforce the system of oppression that underlies consumerism. Now let's diverge from the point of departure and consider whether something like the fat positivity movement is really that good for people. Of course, the fat positivity movement insists that they are loving and caring and that their appreciation of fat bodies is part of their universal love for humanity and diversity. But if we actually think about what the effect of this movement is, we might come to understand that this is a very perverted version of love that, in fact, harms people. Heart disease is the leading cause of preventable death in the United States, and obesity puts one at risk for heart disease. To promote obesity and to reassure obese persons that their obesity is perfectly okay has the effect of disincentivizing them to do anything about their weight. The most radical of the fat positivity activists will promote lies such as healthy at any size that, quite frankly, just get people killed by convincing them of a delusion that somehow their obesity is not a deadly disease. The more radical this movement gets, the more we might see the emergence of an anti-exercise philosophy based on the notion that health is subjective and that the connection between health and exercise promotes harmful stereotypes about fat people. At this point, you might ask the question whether the fat positivity movement actually cares about people, because if your care and love leads to early preventable death, you're not acting in the best interests of the people you purport to care about. And really, that's kind of what love and care is. It's wanting the best outcomes for the people in question. If something someone really likes is killing them, encouraging them to keep engaging with it means you want them to die. This kind of dilemma obviously exists with addicts. For example, if someone is drinking 10 shots of vodka per day and you supply them with more alcohol because you care about them, you don't really care about them in the end. Your love is pathological to them. If you really loved them, you would stage an intervention and try to get them help so they won't die, no matter if your help is in some way stigmatizing to them. People who denigrate the obese will usually justify it by saying that they want to give obese people a reason to get healthy. It's easy to morally posture about how hateful this is and how awful the discrimination is, but in a way, people who make fun of fat people really do care about them more than the fat positivity movement does. There's always a point where acceptance is irresponsible, and the acceptance of the left here reaches into irresponsibility. This is just the same problem as exists in the sex positivity movement, where they'll go as far as to argue that nobody should kink shame feeders and gainers because it's a perfectly valid sex fetish. This is despite the fact that the end result of a feeder fetish is the bodily harm of the gainer. I would not be surprised if these very same people, out of the quixotic principle of universal acceptance, would not defend people with a cannibalism or a snuff fetish. When universal acceptance leads to the acceptance of harmful and antisocial behavior, can the left still call themselves the good guys? Really, calling themselves the good guys has no historical basis at all. Leftism has been responsible for the deaths of over 88 million people. They argue that nationalism necessarily leads to genocide because, after over 2,000 years of nations existing with little in the way of genocides unfolding, one novel political ideology in the 1940s is said to have committed a genocide. But the first time leftism was concretely implemented under a state, it resulted in millions and millions dead. And then it happened a second time in China, and then a third time in Cambodia. Somehow the guys who started killing people immediately after they got a state for their ideology and never stopped since are the good guys. And the nationalists who just want what has been normal for over 2,000 years are the bad guys. Of course, when I say the left, I'm being kind of sloppy. There are obviously different kinds of leftists, like social democrats, anarchists, syndicalists, Marxists, Leninists, Maoists, and Stalinists. You can make a good argument that something like anarchism wouldn't cause genocide since it is, at least in theory, voluntary. Of course, we can take issue with that because of the warlord problem, but just ignore that for the moment. I know there's a big controversy within leftism where the anarchists are calling tankies genociders and so on. But when most leftists make claims about the right, these claims are similarly sweeping. All nationalism is exactly the same. Athenian democracy is exactly the same as the Nazis. Mussolini's fascist Italy, which wasn't responsible for any genocides, is exactly the same as the Nazis. Ultimately, the dialectic just boils down to, if you're a right-wing nationalist, you're a Nazi. And if you're a Nazi, you must necessarily therefore approve of everything Hitler may have done. Because of that, I think I'm justified, at least in the context, or this context, of just rolling all leftism into one team. If the left actually bothered to break down the right by ideology, then it would become pretty obvious that they can't just blame genocide on nationalism. So if that happens, the dialectic just breaks down anyways. And really, if we just boil it down to what happens when our ideologies are implemented concretely in the real world, the implementation of leftism as a state doctrine has almost always caused genocide. The implementation of nationalism caused genocide probably once. And then I have to address the other part of the leftist moral prejudice, which is their defense of minorities. Leftists think that they are the good guys because they support the weak, the disenfranchised, and especially sexual minorities like transgender people. In contrast, the right is supposed to be evil because it morally oppresses these categories. But here, the left is basically ignorant of the externalities of the way they support these minorities. It isn't just that the left supports transgenderism, but rather they support the total skepticism of gender normativity. What works for 99% of society, and what defines 99% of normal people, is directly in the crosshairs of leftists. So often, what started as support for minorities and tolerance of minorities becomes hostility toward normal people, who are not afforded any room in the grand bazaar of commodified identities that the left offers. I know leftists would deny that this is happening, but the fact is that it is actually very culturally common. There is that one study on what a researcher called rapid onset gender dysphoria, and it was noted that these newly transed children would start complaining about heterosexual people as breeders and would come up with a bunch of pejoratives for normal people and basically viewed normal people as evil cishet perpetrators of oppression. I'm not going to bother citing that study because you can find it in my trans video, but the point is there's a plethora of normie hostile trans and gender content on YouTube and TikTok. The identities that work for 99% of people, identities that people themselves adopt, are just cast as gears in a monstrous machine of oppression, and anyone who has these identities must therefore be an oppressor. That's the logic. That's the hostility that the left brings to the table. If you're against the majority of normal people who live in society, normal people who would have ordinarily been considered oppressed in the past by the left in the sense that they were oppressed by class and capitalism, can you really be considered the good guys? The moral prejudice really just reinforces itself because there's a kind of stereotypified, almost kitsch view that any small minority group fighting against a bigger force is a just rebellion. This hostility toward the normal earns the progressive left a lot of enemies, and so they take this backlash from mainstream society as proof of their righteousness, that this rejection of their skepticism of culture must therefore be a sign of conservative oppression. All the while, the good guys have forgotten about the working class. If anything, they have become elitist opponents of the working class themselves, since people in the working class don't have time to read about gender skepticism, transphobia, or systemic racism. They're too busy being oppressed by capitalism, and for the crime of their victimhood, they're to be vigorously opposed as reactionaries. That's the point of view of the good guys. The working class is all conservative, so they don't deserve to be rescued. Meanwhile, these supposedly disenfranchised groups that the left is fighting for, particularly transgender people, aren't at all actually disenfranchised in the modern world. The narrative that the left are fighting for an underprivileged group of oppressed people who are living under fear of a fascist system is just a blatant lie. I watched a video by a leftist feminist King Critical called Debunking the Trans Genocide, and he did an excellent job explaining why there's no such thing as a trans genocide.
Talk about 10 stages. I think first of all we should acknowledge the existence of stage 0. And I say stage 0 because this is before we even start wildly speculating about the idea that a group is experiencing genocide. We need to have at least reached a point where that society isn't actively promoting a certain group and heavily stigmatizing and even criminalizing those who would criticize that group.
The basic fact of the matter is that, as King Critical claims, transgenderism is actively celebrated and promoted by governments and major corporations. Even trans activism takes place from a position of privilege, as most of the actual centers for trans activism, as well as transgender research and lobbying, is paid for by capitalists, some of whom are trans themselves. If transgender people were truly disenfranchised, none of this would be possible whatsoever. And what is untrue for trans people is even less true for homosexuals. Gay marriage has been legal in the United States since 2015. Wikipedia even states that same-sex marriage is legally recognized by a large majority of the world's developed countries. The only exceptions are Italy, Japan, and South Korea. But not having gay marriage is far from a state of total disenfranchisement. In exactly 0 of these countries is sodomy illegal or applied to restrict same-sex sexual activity. It is not illegal to be gay anywhere in the Western world where this kind of leftist discussion actually takes place in. In the United States, there are openly gay politicians like Michael Huffington or Mark Foley. In fact, the Wikipedia page is extremely, extremely long. If homosexuals were in any way disenfranchised in the United States, that just wouldn't be possible. I mean, the whole Republican Party is gay, and that was a little joke. As such, the leftists claim that they are today fighting against oppression is patently false. No one except a few radicals actually wants to make sodomy illegal again, and transgender people do not in any meaningful way lack rights. Now, one can of course argue that the left has fought for these issues in the past against conservatives who did not want sexual liberation, and this is true. Leftist movements were behind the legalization of sodomy in the United States, starting in 1962 and ending in 2004, when all laws against homosexual sex were repealed. Although it's worth mentioning that these laws weren't really much enforced and they were typically only used to punish sex offenders. But what we're dealing with today isn't the historical left. Today we're dealing with people who promote the worst social excesses, the most pathological of acceptance, and the most corrosive of skepticisms against normal values and normal people. The left stopped caring about tolerance a long time ago, and they are now totally in favor of rainbow washing society. And if you don't want to go along with it, you just get labeled an oppressor. They want to upend every single norm, no matter how reasonable it is, and they are on the same side as people like Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze, who tried to get child molestation legalized in France. If you think I'm going too far, just consider that the inventor of queer theory, Gail Rubin, wrote in defense of the sexual liberation of pedophiles in her essay entitled Thinking Sex. That's what the left is. The notion of total sexual liberation literally knows no limits, and that is, in fact, what the modern left supports, whether its individual actors know it or not. When your political movement advocates for the harm of children in the name of minority rights, are you really the good guys? This battle against normalcy has also manifested in a battle against white people. In the first place, the left supports open borders, which is the cultural genocide of white people. They open the borders, displace Western culture, and then blame white people once it has had predictably bad consequences. The left tends to support policies like reparations, which aim to expropriate from all whites, including whites in the working class, by collectively blaming them for colonialism and slavery. Never mind the fact that most whites who live in the United States came here after slavery and colonialism. And also never mind the fact that only around 10% of whites during the period of slavery even owned slaves. No, all white people must be blamed for slavery. What began as a movement protesting against racial discrimination in the 60s, Jim Crow, has become a monstrously anti-white discriminatory movement. In other places, I've called it non-white supremacy because that's what it is. When a non-white person commits a crime, the left always comes out in defense of them, no matter how heinous or bad that crime was. George Floyd pointed a gun at a pregnant woman, but the left insisted on defending him as an innocent victim of the system. Leftists are behind stuff like $0 cash bail that gets violent criminals back out onto the street. There's even something like the Innocence Project, whose express purpose is to free violent black criminals from prison. This has had the predictable result of these black criminals getting out and committing murder again. The most recent guy they freed murdered someone just right after he got out. These people will basically excuse any non-white crime under the sun under the absurd belief that the only reason black people commit crimes is just due to white oppression, not black agency. So again, it's just white people's fault. And when a white person gets in trouble, like Daniel Penny, the left is nowhere to be found at all defending their innocence. It all just comes down to punishing whites and exonerating blacks at any cost. What began as a movement to end discrimination against racial minorities has become a movement in favor of giving racial minorities privileges over white people. That's what affirmative action is. That's what mass immigration is. If you are deliberately favoring one racial group over another in the name of equality, are you really the good guys? If you're casting one racial group in particular as evil oppressors, collectively, without any nuance nor appreciation for those within the group that might be oppressed by capitalism, are you really the good guys? And when you boil this kind of influencer leftism down, it just ends up being the friend-enemy distinction. That us versus them mentality that leftists are always lecturing us as a feature of fascism. If you dare say something bad about fat people, you're a fascist and must be eliminated. If you make right-wing content, you're dangerous and must be eliminated.
Very much so. I've moved full on to the political violence level, or the real violence level, when it comes to conservative people. Yeah, I think they need to be excised from my fucking country. I think they are demonstrably fucking evil people by any moral system that most people would use. And then I just hate them because they tend to destroy the outcomes related to this country, which is what I'm concerned with. Yeah.
This is what it all comes down to. It's not about liberating the working class. It's not about helping minorities. It's not about equity or equality or even ending racism. It's about leftist political hegemony. Leftists have this shtick where they like to point out that every system that exists in society is some kind of reinforcement mechanism for hegemony, a system by which a small group maintains its elite position in society by oppressing others. Maybe all these theories are just a form of projection, that this is actually what the left, by pretending to fight the good fight, are doing, trying to install themselves as an oppressive elite, using sophisticated social systems as a mechanism. When you hate your fellow countrymen so much that you want to see them eliminated, are you really the good guys?